Thanks, Sally, and just to repeat, a very warm welcome to everybody. You may not know, but this is the fifth happy hour session of our autumn-winter series, and we've had a great number of ones already. And today, as you know, it's about the grey and green agenda, where we're going to be looking at issues around passive house sustainable development in relation to housing for older people. And we are joined by a great crew. From David Birkbeck from Housing Design Awards, and many of you know that David and I go back a long way back to the original HAPPI report, where David was instrumental in helping to pull that together. We're joined by several people from Levitt Bernstein, who are going to really dig down into issues that have really sort of come to the fore, and one of them a particularly award-winning scheme from the Housing Design Awards. And we're joined by Claire Myrie, Irene Craig, and Gillian Harrison. And in between them, we're also going to be joined by a long-term friend of the HousingLIN, Liz Alvey, who up until recently was the project manager of the Older Persons Housing Programme at Westminster City Council, and it links in very neatly with the work at Carlton Dene in Westminster that Irene's going to be talking about. We're also very grateful to Tom, who's going to join us, who's going to help move the slides, but also to the UKRI Healthy Ageing Challenge at Innovate UK, who support the HousingLIN and our Happy Hour series. So without further ado, I'm going to invite David to share his slides and to give an overview around the Design for Homes programme, but in particularly some of the key sort of things that came out from a HAPPI perspective in this year's awards. So David, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. There will be some people who are very familiar with the Housing Design Awards. Those who aren't, very briefly, the URL is there. It is a resource of more than 1,000 case studies and more than 100 films. It actually dates back to 1948. It was set up by the National Health Service Secretary at the time, and R.M. Bevan, in the same Act of Parliament, and it's been running ever since. And essentially it exists, unlike most awards programs, it exists to detail the information you need to know about who's been building what and what you should know about if you're thinking about tackling the same issues, the same agendas. So there's a lot of information and very little backslapping or black ties. It's really about kind of chronicling who's doing what and why it matters. You see it all on that website. This year we got, I think, something like a 12th set of entries for what we call the HAPPI Award. We often give more than one. It's always a bit of a battle to choose one from the collection that we got. And I'm just going to give you a clue as to why we chose one and not others, because there were some exceptional schemes. There are every year now. When it was first launched, there was a genuine anxiety we may not be able to find a winner. But we now get exceptional schemes every year, and we have to effectively ignore one or two that would normally get a lot of attention. You'll hear about one of them in the northwest of England in about half an hour. This is a scheme that really caught our eye because it's actually part of the planning policy now in the Greater London Authority. You're not supposed to build residential buildings on their own, commercial buildings on their own of a certain size anymore without a residential element. And so as a form of planning game, we're now beginning to see housing delivered, all types of housing. And it would appear that some people are quite comfortable with the idea of attaching senior housing to commercial office buildings. This is a scheme which you can see bang in the middle of the City of London, just across Blackfriars Bridge, coming down, I think, what would have been the old road to Dover, in that lovely sort of area where you've got some incredible sort of historic assets. And up you go with a really big tall building, but the building they're proposing alongside it is effectively a vertical almshouse. And the big concept with this is that essentially the residential development would be divided into two-story slices. So you'd have sort of micro communities, and these would occupy 2 floors at a time with various shared facilities. So you wouldn't be building an 11 or a 12-story building, expecting people to share everything with a whole load of strangers that would be, say, 8 floors up or 8 floors down. You'd be in a sort of micro community of a comfortable, manageable size. Had a lot of very beautiful design elements, very popular with the judges in terms of a concept. You can see again from this angle, you know, how close you are to some of the key parts of this particular area of London and how it would deal with it by essentially presenting like a commercial building in many ways, but with a lot of residential benefits. And again, you can just about see the two-story expression of these micro communities here. So that scheme, for those who haven't had a look at it, go to the website. It's called Blackfriars Almshouses, designed by a practice called Fathom Architects, who I hadn't come across before in the sector. You know, you've got all the details. If you look at any of these case studies, everything is actually broken down into the size of units, smallest units, parking, you name it, what the density is, who the planning consultants are. And of course, you can get the design and access statement as well. So you can really understand the scheme and you can make contact with the designers. This is another exceptional scheme, a scheme that we got very excited about and would have won, I think, in many years. It's a scheme that effectively imports the type of thing that the HAPPI team discovered in 2009, that the Dutch would build an entire city block as sort of a mixed tenure, mixed generational, intergenerational community, and try to combine all the various different types of residential form with all the key provisions like healthcare and key civic facilities. And this is an attempt to do the same in an area of West Byfleet, which is just down by the A3, M3. And you know, it's a very sizable scheme. I think it's 178 units. We'll double check in a second, but you can see the big idea here is that the residential is over all the key new commercial offers in the town. And so essentially you're asking people to live where everyone would be headed. And that is one of the key HAPPI messages. Don't put people too remote, put them where they would want to go. Clearly, you know, here you're just dropping down into the actual square below. And again, you know, you can see how good quality the space would have been. You'll hear about other developments that have essentially been mixing tenures, mixing generations in a moment. But I mean, I think that sort of this idea of mixing uses is still really fundamental to the whole concept and is key actually in what became the winner. So Botanical Place is this particular scheme. As I guess, I thought it was 178 units. It's 196, so I slightly undercooked it. It's a mixture of private sale and rent. Again, this idea of private rent really taking off in the southeast of England. Really interesting scheme to look at because of that. The scheme that actually won, I suppose, was the winner because it did what we sort of most appreciate in any scheme like this. If you remember the HAPPI report, it boiled everything down into 10 sort of key fundamentals. One was, you know, that essentially homes should be generous enough in size so that they were flexible, ideally having an additional room for, say, a carer or a relative. There are other key things. We talked about the need for daylight. You can see here question number 5, the fact that circulation areas themselves are best not contained in internal corridors, work much better with social spaces, landing decks, deck accesses, all the kind of key things that we're beginning to see more and more. And then there were a couple of other things in here, but one in particular was the idea that each development should add an outward-facing element so that people living within a restricted community should not be restricted from the broader community. And I think this particular scheme you'll see has got a fabulous solution for that. So really, that's why it won. It's very, very difficult. It's just when we were looking at the basics, we thought, well, you know what? It does the communal shared access arrangements really, really well. These are very likely to become social spaces. It's got potentially the most flexible accommodation we'd seen, and it had potentially the best single outward-facing community hub that we saw. So that's why it was selected. I think if I just pick up on the flexibility, you know, you can see you've got essentially the 2 different arrangements. You can either have one large bedroom, or you can have a smaller bedroom, and you can have this sort of sleepover space for your additional person. And it made this point about having this extra care 1+ bed, dealing with it in a way I think that dealt with most of the sort of restrictive rules around that. And also it had this very generous 8.4 meter walkway with these sort of little jutting out elements that effectively invited people to, you know, consider this area a little bit more of a front to this particular flat as opposed to just a corridor. We're very keen on that. You see how it actually mixes the 2 different tenures. You've got the senior block here, you've got the general needs here, but then you've got here, the reason I'm showing you is why the potential mixed use is so exciting. You've got one of the grade 1 listed buildings in this area. It forms one of the sides to the block, and suddenly you've got a lovely new plaza that's going to go in there where previously you had surface car parking. It's got the open access, like we discussed, there's sort of the whole concept that it would effectively move through social spaces as galleries, that these would be used as places to stop and talk, which you can't do so comfortably in a 1,200 metre wide corridor. Not that anybody does this anymore, but this is significantly more the type of thing we'd recommend. And, you know, just another highlight here, I was trying to explain, the walkways are enlarged outside the doors, and you have the dual access, you have the cross ventilation, all the things that people most appreciate, in which were all written as a HAPPI report as key principles. And then into the square next to the Grade 1 church, you can't really see the church because it's sort of where that tree would be, but you can see the cafe is designed in order to essentially sit on this square and create something quite civic, quite important in the local community. Yeah, and you can see how it fits in against the church with the southward view back down towards Mile of and Maid of Aronson. I'm not going to say anything more about it. I'm just going to pick out those key elements. I'm going to let the people who designed it give you all the detail.
David, thanks very much. That was really great, and it was also very helpful to reflect on those 10 principles. I know we're joined by Julia Parker, formerly of Levitt Bernstein, who again was very instrumental in developing those HAPPI design principles. And I'm personally also glad that you're going to join us on the TAPPI project, the technology for an ageing population, because Principle 4 looked at care readiness and technology. So thanks very much for refreshing my memory as well. And we're now going to move on. So I don't know, Tom, if you could share the screen, and then we will invite, I think Claire's going to go first. Is that right?
Actually, it's Irene.
Irene, apologies, Irene.
That's fine.
Well, Irene, sorry, you've joined us before at HAPPI Hour, so again, thanks ever so for joining us, and I'll invite Claire after you.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, we're going to kind of do a fairly swish kind of changeover between us, I think, because I'm going to jump in again after Claire. But yeah, thanks very much, Jeremy, and thank you, David. That was a really lovely introduction to the scheme that we're going to present. Said lots of things that I was going to say as well, which is great, because it's sort of really reinforcing what we were trying to achieve with the scheme. Yeah, so if we can go to the next slide, Tom. Yeah, just wanted to say a few words about Levitt Bernstein, just in terms of our background. I won't take too long, but just for those who don't know us very well, we're a practice of architects, but also importantly landscape architects and urban designers, which really reflects the holistic way that we like to look at all of our projects. We look at not just the buildings, but the spaces, the really important spaces between those buildings as well. And I think that's especially important for our older people's housing in terms of well-being and looking out onto green and onto nature. We're quite a large practice. We're about 130 people in total between our main office in London, but also a really thriving studio up in Manchester as well. And Gillian, who's going to be speaking later about our scheme in Preston, is based up in Manchester, and we're making great strides up there with our housing work there. The other important thing is that we don't just do housing. A lot of our housing clients don't realise that we also design theatres, education buildings, so lots of work in other sectors, which actually might not sound completely irrelevant, but actually can inform some of our other housing schemes, particularly where we have a mix of uses within one particular building. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to kick off with Claire, who is our Head of Sustainability. She's going to give a little bit of a primer on Passivhaus low and low energy design. And so it's fairly high level, but for those hopefully in the audience who don't know too much about it, that'll give you some background. I'm then going to focus on Carlton Dene as a case study. And Liz Alvey is going to jump in then with the Westminster Council sort of client perspective, which is always fascinating. And then Gillian's going to round off with a case study looking at slightly different sustainability agenda around our scheme called the Courtyards in Preston. So over to you, Claire, I think.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about passive house design and how that's influenced some of our schemes. So first off, just to say, low energy buildings are the new normal. We see passive house as part of that. the levels of efficiency that Passive House generates is just one way to put us on the path to zero carbon, and we support this as a way of thinking at Levitt Bernstein, and have more than 10 schemes achieving the aims of Passive House, 3 of which are older persons housing. This isn't to say that Passive House is the only way, it's just one of the ways, and it doesn't necessarily need to be certified as long as the principles are followed in a rigorous way, although certification sometimes does guarantee a bit more quality on site. So some of the schemes you'll see here, older people's housing, Carlton Dene will be talked about in a moment, but it really doesn't, the buildings don't have to look different, they don't have to feel different, they just are performing better. Next please, Tom. So why Passive House? Well, it's an established standard that's well tested, and we produced an easy guide just to help translate the design of a Passive House, and we produced this alongside Etude, and it's endorsed by the Passivhaus Trust, and it kind of distills those design decisions needed. Passive House uses an ultra low energy building fabric to meet targets such as space heating demand, which we'll talk about later in Carlton Dene, and show you how we compare to the space heating demands required. This guide is available to download for free, so it's available on our website. And then I'll just talk you through some of the key principles within this guide, just on the next slide. So principles of Passive House are we're trying to get the free heat in the winter. So this means orientating our buildings in the right direction. That means typically north-south. East-west still works, but it's about moderating those heat gains through the windows. Then we're looking at a simple building form. So we're looking for a compact building form to reduce the heat losses through the building fabric, so reduce the extra heat losses through longer areas of wall, larger areas of roof, so we're bringing that fabric in. Then we're highly insulating that building fabric, making sure any heat losses are contained, and that relates to having an extremely airtight fabric as well as reduced thermal bridges. In order for this to kind of balance out and lead to the right result, we need window proportions that are based on the orientation. It means triple glazing, but it also means larger area of glazings typically to the south, smaller areas to the north. That allows more sun in and a lower heating bill and less heat out. So getting the right proportions of windows on the envelope is another key decision that needs to happen in the design of the building. Then sometimes it's a bit of a myth that people think that Passive House is a non-naturally ventilated building. It can be naturally ventilated, and we think it should be naturally ventilated. So you are able to open your windows, and then you have a background ventilation system, which is just a replacement of what ordinarily would be bathroom extract fans and trickle vents. So that background ventilation is working hard to keep the heat in the building whilst providing you with fresh air. Then we use predictive energy modelling, so PHPP, to make sure that that building is hitting those targets. Just to kind of touch on how this relates to older people's housing, you know, using these principles and getting the design right from day one, it helps with lower fuel costs and energy bills for residents, and a more comfortable and stable internal environment. So less fluctuation between summer and winter, less fluctuation between day and night, really helping to make sure people are comfortable in their homes with low energy bills.
Great, thanks, Claire. So what I'm going to do is take you through our Carlton Dene scheme that we've been working on Westminster City Council with. We can go to the next slide, Tom, and just sort of, as well as explaining the scheme, also relate back to some of those Passive House principles and how we've developed the design with those in mind, and the sort of outcomes that we've arrived at. So some of these images are going to be familiar because David's already shared some of them with you. Just a little bit of background. The site is in South Kilburn in London, sort of on the boundary with Brent Council as well. It sits, as David said, right next to a Grade 1 listed, very impressively scaled church, which gave us quite a lot of historic contextual issues that we had to deal with in terms of the heights, setbacks of the building, particular views that the planners were very concerned that we should retain of the spire of the building. So there were some issues there that we had to deal with from day one in terms of the heights and the design of the building. It's on the site of a previous care home, which has now been relocated, which Liz worked on the new version that people have moved into. And also a small block of a small council-owned block of apartments as well, which we have re-provided within the new scheme as a sort of general needs part of the scheme. So the brief for the building was to provide extra care, but also a small general needs block with separate access. So you could say in some ways it is an intergenerational scheme. We have 65 extra care flats which sit on the left-hand side of the two blocks that you can see on the screen, and 22 general needs flats on the right-hand side in that more compact block. And I think the things to note here are going back to those initial HAPPI principles of daylight, sunlight, ventilation, and also contact with your neighbours. We developed this as a courtyard scheme, and it sort of follows on from one or two other schemes that we've developed recently, and the courtyard being one that you'll see at the end of this presentation. This sort of typology where people can come and go with an open access deck and see their neighbours across the courtyard looking up and down, and be very aware of people coming and going and the activity that's going on. And you can also see here the church in the background, and what a big impact that has on the scheme. And this is a different view from the south, from Carlton Vale, which, and again, this is all about how we carved away at the mass of the building to create some of these glimpses and views of the church. And here we're looking at the extra care on the left again, and the general needs on the right. And, again, thinking how carefully we have to think about heights and those views. On to the next one, Tom. So just looking at how the building is laid out, this is the ground floor plan, and going back to that point about the outward facing part of this project, at the top of the plan you can see the cafe, which is a public facing cafe which opens out onto this new new potential public space, which is also fronted by the church. And then over the other side of Kilburn Park Road, there is also a new development as part of the South Kilburn Master Plan as well, with a new route coming through. So it's a real opportunity here to create quite a buzz and quite a focal point. And so this cafe opens out onto that. It's drawing the community in, as well as allowing the people in the scheme the opportunity to sit somewhere within their own building, but also to be mixing with other people, which is so important, I think. And then you can see how the apartments then wrap around the courtyard. We have a small area of parking in between, and then the general needs block sits to the right-hand side. And then this is a typical upper floor. So again, you can see the kind of circular nature of that, the walkway that runs in front of all of those flats. And then this floor shows the roof terrace, which sits to the south, where we've dropped the height away to allow sun into that courtyard, which is, it's an urban block. It's a reasonably tight courtyard, but we've dropped the height to allow more sun in the middle of the day. And then we also have the flats to the west are on a busier road, and because they're facing west, we also have to be really mindful about overheating. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of how we were balancing that against the passive house issues and wanting to bring as much daylight into the flats as possible while dealing with noise as well. So there were quite a few competing issues that we've been having to deal with. And then this, you'll recognise this this diagram as well. So this is the 1 bed plus that David was mentioning earlier, which we've developed across a couple of schemes. We've used it in our Melville Gardens scheme, which we did a talk about last year. I think it was, sorry, my throat's giving out. And Westminster Council also very mindful of the issues of flexibility and adaptability for their residents, so they can stay in place as long as possible within their own homes, but also attracting people who might be wanting to downsize out of existing council homes and freeing up larger stock for other people. And giving this little bit of extra flexible space maybe allows people just to think twice about wanting to move into something rather than a standard one-bed flat. So we're hoping that that's really going to give additional benefits to the council too. And then the important thing that was mentioned earlier about the access deck and the little moments of generosity outside people's front doors, where there's a place to sort of make it their own and to linger and to say hello to their neighbours. I've had a cold, I'm afraid, so I'm hoping I don't. I'll carry on. Tom, you need to be in the wings. So next slide. This is a view looking down into the courtyard from one of the upper floors, and you can see the roof terrace and the, oh dear, I am really starting to lose it. You can see the roof terrace at the other end of the image, which is part of the circulation route as well for people on that floor. But you really get a sense of the idea that people can see what's going on around the different floors, how they can see up and down and see people coming and going. And so that if you want to be private, you can, but if you want to come out and see the world go by and say hello, you can also do that and look down into the courtyard, see who's down there, maybe go and join people if you want to. Next one, Tom. And this is again the image of the cafe and that sort of more formal frontage that fronts onto that that new public space that we're creating between our new building and the church, which is really going to, we hope, going to be sort of have that real civic presence and also a really welcoming entrance and somewhere that people are really going to feel proud, I think, to call it their home and be their home. And then just a little bit more about the energy and sustainability, sort of the facts and figures, if you like, of the energy and sustainability, because there is a difference between the two parts of the building in terms of the final standards that we're meeting. So we were aiming for passive house for both parts of the scheme originally. and we then, as the design developed and we looked at all the different factors that were coming into play, we then decided, partly through cost and partly through what was right for the older people as residents, that we've ended up with two slightly different standards. The general needs block going for the full passive house certified route, and the extra care going for a slightly lower standard, which is called the low energy standard, which is still within the sort of passive house family. But there were various reasons for that. And some of it is to do with the issues that Claire was talking about. So form factor, which is the shape of the building, how much the kind of the walls and the roofs go in and out, up and down, push and pull in different directions. We felt that the balconies were particularly important, particularly on, oh, Tom, I think you are going to have to take over. I'm sort of losing my voice here.
All right, so I'll jump in. So we were looking at, yeah, the form factor and thinking about the day-to-day lives of the older people. So on the west facade there on the diagram here, there's quite a busy road, so we're conscious that actually possibly like a semi-recessed balcony there could give residents more protection and a bit more privacy, which, but by doing that, it has then like a knock-on the form factor, so that's what makes it slightly harder to achieve. Also as well, there's a number of sort of heritage considerations, such as setbacks, being conscious of the adjacent church, that all sort of come into play and contribute to that slightly sort of lower performing form factor. As well, there was also lots of sort of civic spaces, such as sort of extra glazing at ground floor, which was north facing in this case, which you know, we could have very stingy windows there, but it's about also balancing the benefits of the scheme to the area as well. So it's you know, energy performance is really, really important, but it's also thinking long term of the people that are going to live there and sort of trying to make get a balance there and get something that works for everyone, really. Interesting as well, so that's performance fed through onto things like the wall build-ups, the window performance, so it very much gets sort of baked in at quite an early stage. Claire, did you want to mention any of these, the energy heating points at the bottom there?
Yeah, so just to say the two figures that you can see on the scheme, the 30 kilowatt hours per metre squared for the block A and the 14 kilowatt hour per metre squared for block B. Those are the space heating demand targets that we've met. So the 14 in green, that's achieving the passive house standard, the classic standard. The 30 is going for that lower energy target. But just to say, an ordinary housing scheme for the GLA would typically hit around 50 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year. So you can just see how much lower they are, and it is significant that the drop between a typical scheme and an energy efficient scheme.
Mm-hmm. And so in terms of some of these sort of passive features that are built into the scheme as well, on the left there's an image of the south facing facades where there's solar shading over the windows to sort of help produce some of those peak solar gains during the summer. Whereas compare that to the right-hand image, which is the west facing facade, which is typically the hardest facade to deal with overheating and the low-level summer sun. So on those areas, we actually looked at sliding screens over some of the larger glazing areas just to reduce the peak temperatures, and there was also a ambient heat loop incorporated in both blocks, which is there to essentially just help in the peak temperatures, which I think we've all been getting a flavour of this year, and hopefully that's there as a backup if it is needed. Liz.
Right, thank you. Thanks, Tom and Irene. Can you hear me all right? Great. So I'm going to talk about my role for Westminster City Council, which has just finished, in fact, but I worked for the council for 3.5 years as a consultant, providing the intelligent client role. If you can move the slide on, please, Tom. Thank you. So yeah, so I should just say Carlton Dene is part of a Westminster City Council's long-term strategy to improve the quality and choice for older people, of housing and care for older people. And I was asked to take on the role of intelligent client, which, as I say, I did for about 3.5 years, ending a couple of weeks ago. And there are two key elements, really. One was about coordinating across key departments and with our team of consultants, including Levitt Bernstein, to make sure that everybody works together to deliver this scheme. One of the challenges, I think, of delivering extra care housing is that it sits across so many different council departments, and sometimes the priorities and levels of knowledge in different departments are quite different, and aren't always, and sometimes can be quite challenging to bring them all together. So having worked, I've specialised in extra care housing for 20 years, and having worked in adult social care, having worked in housing associations and also in the construction industry, I guess I've had sufficient experience to understand some of those drivers from different departments and be able to bring them together. The other part of my role and what I try to bring to the table is the specialist product knowledge, obviously gained from that 20 years, because it's about how everything fits together, really. It is very much about how schemes are used, how they work, what it takes to get them up and running, and so that was very much something that I was bringing to the table. Sometimes it's about, specifically, was about briefing colleagues, particularly people in the development team who are extremely competent developers but don't necessarily know about older people. Conversely, colleagues in adult social care who know exactly what the issues are for older people but don't necessarily know or need to know how a building actually gets put together and created. So and equally working with the architects who know how to build a building, and obviously, as you will have gathered from the conversation so far, Levitt Bernstein know a lot about older people, but the devil is always in the detail, and there are sometimes things that come up that if you haven't actually worked in a scheme, you don't necessarily know. So it's been, I think, a very fruitful partnership working with Levitt Bernstein to try and iron out some of those wrinkles that sometimes, without detailed scrutiny, end up in a built form, which, you know, is a shame, because that doesn't have to be. So moving on to slide 2, and at the risk of upsetting my architect colleagues, the point for me is not about having a lovely building, although that is important. The point is, for me, and indeed more importantly for the council, is having a service that will improve the lives of the people who receive it. So with that in mind, there were 4, I think, key drivers for the design development. First, foremost, and absolutely above all else, is people. But that's not just about the potential future residents, but also people who work there, because having a good quality service is very much dependent on having a consistent and happy workforce, and having a nice place to work is part of that. Also, for people who visit, we've talked already, and you've heard about the importance of connections, and that is absolutely critical. So that's very much linked to place. Now, this scheme, as you've heard, sits right on the edge of Westminster, and sits adjacent to a large Westminster Council housing estate, where there isn't an awful lot going on. I mean, there's a lot going on in terms of the residents, but there aren't an awful lot of facilities. For me, these sorts of schemes do not exist in isolation, so it's very important for Carlton Dene to be part of the community, and for people to feel that it's relevant to them, not just if they happen to be an older person or have an older relative. And that, again, was very much part of the thinking that we had. The other thing I've put down there is pride, and I think that's a really important and often overlooked thing. Feeling good about where you live is an important part of well-being, and well-being, really feeling good, influences physical and mental health positively, and can do. I want to tell a little story, really, I think, to illustrate this. One of the very first extra care schemes I was involved in developing, we had a resident who moved in, a gentleman in his 60s who had a terminal cancer diagnosis. And one of his priorities was to get back in touch with the daughter who he'd lost touch with many years before, when he'd been through various drug and alcohol issues. And he'd ended up living in a whole succession of not very nice bedsits and private rented accommodation. And he had never, even when he got clean, he'd never felt able to get back in touch with his daughter, because he didn't feel he had anywhere that he could invite her to start bringing them back in touch. And after he moved into the extra care scheme, he said to me, I now feel I've got somewhere that I'm proud to live, and where I can show her who I am now, and not the person that she remembered. And they were indeed able to get back in touch with each other. And I've never forgotten that, because that for me was an absolutely critical thing in terms of how important it is for people to feel pride about in where they live, and what a difference that can absolutely make to them. But of course, no good feeling proud and living in a beautiful building if it doesn't actually work as a building. You know, even if it meets all the certification standards, if the building doesn't work to enable the delivery of services, then it doesn't work. So actually, not just on the day it opens, but also in the longer term. Again, if you'll forgive me telling another little story, the very first scheme I ever visited when I first got into this, I was shown around by the manager, and I remember saying to her, "Oh, it's really beautiful and how lovely it all looks." And she kind of gave me a rather sideways look, which was a bit strange. And she then took me and showed me this enormous cupboard, absolutely filled with, I didn't even know there were so many different sorts of light bulbs. And the issue was that all these different light fittings meant that, you know, changing a light bulb was absolutely a nightmare. So again, I've never forgotten that the importance of having something that's workable, that's practical, is critical. Moving on to the last slide, I just want to focus on a few specifics that we addressed during the design development, some of which have been touched on already. The first one is about access and about wayfinding. So that's really about how do people get in and out of the building and how do they move around within it. And that includes things like deliveries, things like how do you deliver to the kitchen? Because if you don't, I've seen a lot of buildings over the years, including some quite recently, where there isn't sufficient height access to allow a delivery lorry to deliver to the kitchen, which means that you're taking things through a public entrance. It's more difficult, it's more time consuming, it disrupts, and it's just not how it should be, and it's unnecessary if these things are thought through from the beginning. But the most important part of this is also about how to balance giving the residents the important safety and security that they need, but also not to make them feel like they're imprisoned. And it's a really hard balance, and I'm not, I don't think anyone ever solves that problem completely. But also, how do you ensure that legitimate visitors can get access when they need to, when they want to, but deter those who have less healthy and maybe have nefarious purposes. So trying to make sure that the systems and the layout of the building works in order to provide the relevant checks and balances, but not make it feel like there are so many checks and balances that your visitors never want to visit you, because again, that's part of making sure that the scheme works from a community point of view. So that being part of a wider community was a very important driver for Carlton Dene, and specifically we wanted to ensure that the wider community could use things like the cafe, but also the hairdresser, and there is also a changing places facility. Carlton Dene, the location of Carlton Dene is very close to the Paddington Recreation Ground, which is an enormously well used facility that in that local area. So we wanted to make sure that people might want to use the cafe if they're using the rec. They might want to use the changing places. So these things needed to be known about and visible. And so they all have certainly the cafe, as you've already seen, and the hairdresser, and indeed there's a small meeting room which has access from the street, controlled access for the reasons that we've talked about, but has access from the street to enable people to use it, but more importantly to see it. So that it's both visible and accessible, and people don't have to go into the scheme and navigate those sorts of things in order to be able to use them. I also want to talk about overheating. Now, I do feel a slight fraud in that I am not a technical expert, and having listened to the conversations about Passivhaus and so on, I must admit, not remotely interested in certification of things. What I do care about is having a healthy building that doesn't cost too much to run, either for the residents or for the organisation that runs it. And we had a number of conversations about overheating and the risk of overheating. I think the risks of older people being cold or too cold and what can happen is very well understood. But overheating is perhaps less well understood, but there is a growing body of research. And given the reports recently, if you've seen them on the BBC, of excess deaths this summer because of the extreme heat, there can never have been a more important time to make sure that the building does work for people and keeps them healthy, doesn't actually make them sick. One of the key things I've learned from the conversations that we had, not so much with the architects, but with our specialist consultants, is to define the parameters, because actually their driver to get to a certain targets and get to certain solutions isn't necessarily going to deliver what you want. So I was very clear with them that for me the parameters were about a minimum and a maximum healthy temperature, and how they delivered that was well outside my area of competence, but they needed to be able to design a solution that would actually deliver that. So having vigilance, understanding vigilance, and a detailed scrutiny of that, I think, during the design development is really critical. Of course, during the design development, COVID reared its very ugly head. And so we, Tom and I, did a very careful review using the HousingLIN guidance, which I think there'll be a link to in the chat, to make sure that the things that had been learned through the pandemic we could feed into the design of the building before it was too late. Without wanting to sound too complacent, I'm really pleased to say that a lot of the decisions we'd already made about the importance of fresh air and visibility and visual access and all of those kind of things, connectedness, really meant that when we went through the document, for the most part, we'd already covered most of those things, separate access for staff and things like that, and that anything like specific hand washing facilities, for example, in the front hallway that we hadn't already included could easily be added because there's pipe work already and there's space and the like. I think that's probably all. I'm going to stop there because I've probably already exceeded my time, as is my wont. But obviously there were lots and lots and lots of other things which I'm sure might come up in the questions, but I'll hand on now to the next speaker.
Thank you, Liz. So just to finish off our presentation today, I'm going to run briefly through our project at the Courtyards in Preston. Next slide, please. So as David alluded to earlier, we were this close to a Housing Design Award by the sound of it this year. We were shortlisted for this project that we actually started working on in 2014. So it's been quite a long journey for this project, and I think an awful lot has changed in that intervening period, particularly around energy targets and energy standards. So we didn't have quite the same stringent energy targets, but you can see within this scheme a lot of the same principles in terms of the HAPPI principles and things like good levels of daylight and natural ventilation, and the way that we have always designed to try and make best use of those passive measures prior to those really stringent energy targets that we're now working towards. So next slide, please, Tom. Little bit of background as to where we are in the country for anyone who doesn't know Preston. So towards the bottom of the slide there is the centre of Preston. Up the right hand side you've got the M6, and across the top you've got the M55 going across to Blackpool. The Courtyards is located in a suburb called Ingle, which is in the northwest where the yellow dot is. So we are in a very sort of low scale, if you go to the next slide, as a suburban area of low rise housing. So really quite a different context to that which you saw at Carlton Dene, a little bit more tucked away, but also within a very established residential community. The site itself was the sort of green field, a very clean site. Again, doesn't have quite the same constraints, but we are also cognizant of our neighbours and our relationships with the surrounding area. So as the name might suggest, our client Community Gateway Association chose the name, called the scheme the Courtyards, very much derived from the way in which we had designed the building. Their original brief to us for this was their first scheme for older people. Their brief was, please deliver us a scheme that ticks all the HAPPI principle boxes, and so we're really proud of what we've achieved here, because we have managed to deliver on all of those criteria. So the scheme is designed around these two main landscaped courtyards, one that's slightly more public towards the front of the site, and then one that you can see completely encircled by the building, which is private for residents. We did also sort of tongue-in-cheek refer to the parking area as the third courtyard. It's always important to try and mitigate the impact of parking and break down those spaces. And if you go to the next slide, please, Tom, you can then see how the apartments themselves are laid out in a loop around that central courtyard. I want to draw attention to a couple of things which will be important as I come back later in the presentation to talking about the social sustainability that is the main purpose of the presentation today. So first of all is the central area where you can see the label of Bistro. So that's the kind of heart of this development, is a cafe bistro area with an activity room associated with it that sits within a core part of the design, which I will show you in more detail shortly. It also extends through from the entrance, which comes in from the top of the slide there, So it's very easy to orient yourself within this building, and the social spaces connect everything else together. And the other thing I just want to draw attention to here is the circulation. So as you saw at Carlton Dene, the circulation is on the inner face of that courtyard, looping around, with one exception on this project, which is where the parking area is. So we flipped that one wing so that the circulation faces out onto the car park, primarily so that the view from people's living spaces was on to the courtyard. And I will come back to that in a little bit more detail later on. So next slide. So this was an early concept diagram. So really this is all about connections and about community. As I'm sure everybody on this call will understand, this type of development is very much about creating opportunities for community, opportunities for connection, but also maintaining independence. If people have moved from their own home, and that's quite a big step, you still want that opportunity to maintain your independence. So there's a lot of work in the design here to allow you to feel connected to your neighbours and to other people within the building, but still within your own home. And that was really important during COVID. So the circulation corridors that I've just mentioned are internal on this scheme, as opposed to Carlton Dene where they were external. So it's easy to imagine how the windows between the dwelling and that circulation area could be a good candidate for value engineering when they have to be fire rated. They may have to be insulated depending on where your thermal line is. So it's an easy target for value engineering. And I think every time we visited the building and talked to the operators and visited with other clients, the value of those windows can't be underestimated during a time like COVID, and then actually all the time anyway, for people who want to stay at home, but you kind of want to just know that there's someone passing by, and people passing by can see that you're there and that you're up and around and happy without you having to directly interact with anyone. Next slide. So this our professional photographer that we had on this scheme has a drone, which is fantastically exciting. So we have aerial shots of the courtyard in its finished form, and then on the next slide you get the sort of human scale view of that space. Really lovely planting, really verdant. Residents are very excited about some of the fruit trees and things, and seeing how they evolve through the seasons. And then I'll just take you through a little bit more detail on some of these external areas. So the thresholds are really important between people's private space. We've talked about how that works internally, but within the external area, there's no sort of hard, fast barrier as to exactly where your garden, your private external space ends at ground floor and the courtyards begin. And it creates really lovely opportunities for people to personalise that space. And those spaces are quite generous as well. So the nature of the existing context, we've got a lot of trees around the site, so we've got a lot of birds, a lot of squirrels, a lot of dedicated residents who want to feed the local wildlife. But we also have, we talked earlier about maintaining activity for residents. So you can see these photographs at the bottom are not staged. This is the day that we went to take photographs of this scheme. This is I mean, it was a lovely day, but people will just walk around the courtyard, perch on a garden wall, talk to a resident. The staff at the building, as they're caring for people, will use those routes in order to provide daily exercise for residents. And then on the next slide, you see some more features of that courtyard. I think Liz touched on pride in where you live, and we talked a lot about how long visitors will stay, and a lot of that has to do with what their kids, what the grandkids are up to while they're visiting grandparents. So we incorporated informal space for children. So there isn't a play area that looks strangely sort of unused when there's nobody using it, but there is within the landscape these sort of giant granite balls and walls and other things that children sort of naturally gravitate towards, that creates visual stimulation within that courtyard, and is really just a lovely thing that goes on in that space. Planting, very similar. All of the surrounding areas have got really generous planting, and as I said, residents really enjoy that. In the corridor shots that you can see there, you'll see seating that we don't have any photographs of it in use, but from recent visits, we know they are really well used, that people like to sit in those corridors and look out into the courtyard. You can do that at every floor, not just the ground floor, because the windows, the sill heights are lowered so that when you're sitting outside your property or even through the kitchen window, you can see down into the courtyard. And then next slide, thank you. Just So going back to that concept image that we'll just re-show here on this slide to remind you how that focuses the design into the centre of the scheme. Basically, it's a singular black barn that houses all of our communal facilities, a bistro at ground level, but it also has a hairdresser's, has some medical spaces, has a laundry. And from wherever you are in the site, the design lets you know where that space is externally, and then internally, all of our circulation loops come through that space. So at ground floor, you can travel through that space, but also at the upper level on a raised walkway, which has seating on it. So if you're not particularly social that day, but you'd like to sit in that space, you can sit up on the walkway and look down, and you see the lady in orange there who's looking up back at us. And I think the key message about this space, I think, is the design, which obviously we are able to input into, but also the operator. So the ladies who operate this bistro, as they call it, the food's great. I can confirm the food is absolutely delicious, and it's also been kept at reasonable prices, so that all the residents are really happy to spend time there. They have visitors come in, but also lots of members of the local community. If you sit in that cafe for sort of half an hour, you hear all sorts of people who've come in from other areas. The word of mouth has spread that there's a lovely cafe here, and lots of people are using it. So that connection to the existing surrounding community, as well as the connections within the building, are working really, really well. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Well, can I thank all five of you of really wonderful presentations. They flowed excellently, and in fact, I think, Gillian, we're looking forward to a case study on the courtyards in due course, and I really look forward to perhaps even getting up there to Preston to host a North West HousingLIN regional event, because I think actually going around it will also bring to life a lot of the pictures and the descriptions you've shared. Irene, I hope you're feeling a little bit better. With a happy hour, can I recommend a little drink of water? And David, thanks for kicking it off this afternoon with your sort of introduction. And I was really interested to see about those links, not just to extra care, but also other forms of housing for people in later life, like almshouses, and that connectivity with commercial and retail as well. So again, there's been a lot of things coming through, and so much so that we've got nearly 10 questions as well already in the session, in the Q&A box from this session. So without further ado, I'm going to sort of just do a bit of pick and mix, and I'm not sure whether there's just one person who's an anonymous attendee or whether it's a selection of people who've not given their names. But you know, let me just kick off from the top, if that's okay. So the first question is, with Passive House having an extremely airtight principle, how's the risk of damp mitigated? Is it for people who struggle to pay bills and don't put the heating on, or are worried about opening windows because of perceived heat loss? Does anybody want to pick up on that, Claire? Or
shall I go on that one?
Yep.
Yeah. So the key with Passive House, you have good airtightness but good ventilation to match it. So actually you're much less likely to see mold and condensation build up in homes that are passive houses. That's because they have the background mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. So instead of relying on trickle vents and extract fans, which you would in a sort of typical home, the background ventilation is running at all times to make sure that the moisture is under control. Doesn't mean that residents can't open their windows as well, but typically we see lower humidity levels as well as a result of using mechanical ventilation.
Thanks for that. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment, or if I move on to the next question, which again follows this theme about Passive House and what it rewards, and it focuses particularly about the reduction in thermal bridging. And we saw a lot of bridging in terms of external walkways and corridors and the like. And so, you know, how are the heat losses through the walkways addressed? Is that something that you measure?
It's perhaps one that I can pick up. We treat the walkways typically as separate standalone elements in the same way as you would treat a balcony. So you make sure that there is either a sort of a thermal connection or it is fully insulated around, so they are sort of treated as almost separate to the main simple envelope, which is then sort of really sort of compact and easy to insulate.
Thanks for that, Tom. And again, picking up perhaps even some of the issues that Liz raised about, you know, the practicality of managing and operating, looking at some of this in relation to construction costs. Again, another question about, you know, what difference does it make to construction cost building to Passive House standards? And I don't know whether any of you or David wants to come back to that.
I can
Yeah,
Touch a little bit, or
Claire.
Irene? Yeah.
Claire's been doing
Yeah.
quite a bit of work with called Cost of Carbon with a number of London councils, which has had that cost element. So I'll let Claire.
Yeah, so and actually we did a cost exercise on Carlton Dene with Westminster, the client, and we also did it on a sister sort of scheme that we're designing at the same time. And actually, when you break down each element of the building, it's fabric, it's additional insulation that goes with it, it's triple glazed windows, the fact that they're potentially smaller windows or more managed windows, the uplifting cost isn't as large as you might typically expect. So we see uplifts of anything to sort of 10 to 25% as a best guess on schemes, and actually a lot of that is associated with the perceived risk of building to passive house, and that's around meeting the airtightnesses on site. When it comes to actually costing each element, you know, the small increase in insulation, the better thermal bridging, the window designs, actually we're seeing costs coming out at something like a 2 to 4% increase in construction costs. So a lot of the costing that we're currently seeing coming out is perceived risk. And Passive House also did a study on costs, and they came out with a slightly higher figure of 6 to 8%. But I think the point is, the more building regulations is moving forward, we're seeing the Future Home Standard coming in 2025. That's pushing us closer and closer to Passive House. So actually the difference between what is the new standard, as it were, and Passive House is becoming smaller and smaller as we move forward.
David, you've been instrumental in various standards, you know, designing for healthy life, HAPPI, building regs, etc. Any thoughts on this?
I'm aware of the fact that the Passive House standard was formalised in 1994. The first time it was built in 1990, and that currently there have been about 30,000 of them built in Germany. Well, that would equate to less than 0.25% a year in the country where the standard was created of their output. So there's clearly an issue for everybody in dealing with it. It's a brilliant standard, but I think one of the things to remember is that it's not the only standard, as Claire kept saying. And if the Germans themselves consider it to be relatively arcane and not worth their time, it's interesting to recognise that the things that they use by the hundreds of thousands, as opposed to 0.25% of their output. And I would always recommend people look at some of the other types as well.
Well, thanks for that. And again, you know, I think we've tried to reflect that there are a broad range of sustainability issues, and we'll come back to some of these. And Liz, you talked about running costs and things like this, which obviously relate for very many people into service charge. Again, another question about the heating demands compared to general needs block. Any thoughts on that?
Not specifically. I mean, but I do think it's very important. And I think if I can kind of also allude to the last question, for me, the important thing is not to be driven by the standard, but to be driven by what you want the building to achieve. And if that enables you to tick that box of achieving a standard, then great. And it is important. And things like sustainability and carbon neutrality and so on are very important, certainly to Westminster City Council. But what's actually driving this whole thing is how much, is it practical to live there? Is it safe to live there? Is it enjoyable to live there? And can you afford to live there? And certainly we did a lot of work quite separately actually from the design development, because I'm very conscious that the service charge is potentially the single most difficult thing. You've got a lot of communal facilities to pay for, and there's only a certain number of people, and given that this is 100% social rent, that these people are not your wealthy cohort of people who might be able to afford it and won't have some substantial disposable income. So running costs, both for the operator and obviously most importantly for the resident, are really, really important. And think that, another reason for opening up things like the cafe, for example, to the wider community is so that the cost doesn't fall completely on the resident. In my experience, the cafe is the single most difficult thing to make work financially. And if you don't have external customers or a significant level of subsidy, then it won't work. And what you do need to make sure is that you can sustain that service because people will rely on it. So sorry, I'm not sure if I've directly answered your question, but
well, it's one of the questions that we've come through. I don't know whether Gillian or Claire want to respond to that question about the heating demand compared to general needs.
So I suppose what we're saying is through the meeting the Passive House standard, we're looking at about a 70% reduction in your heating, space heating bills, and the block A, that's slightly on the low carbon side, is something like a 40% reduction. So it's significant. You know, this is going to make a difference to people's lives and their day-to-day energy bills.
Well, I was also struck by when you were talking, Claire, earlier, that it's actually not just about the affordability and the bills, but also improved health outcomes as well. And I think that's something that Liz reflected on again in her presentation. The next question from Katie is about this principle of local authorities agreeing to 1.5 bedrooms, please. Any comments from Liz to start off with, or others about this?
Yeah, it is something we discussed. I mean, I'm very well aware from years of developing these things that there are issues about affordability and so on, and I think the 1.5 is a very good compromise. I mean, we did talk initially at the very early stages about whether or not we should include 2 beds, but for all sorts of reasons that was not the case. And I'm certainly aware from talking to colleagues in other authorities recently that schemes have been built with 2 beds where it's been very difficult to let them. I think it's obviously very different if you are selling or leasing in the private market, but for social rented, for all sorts of reasons, it's difficult. So for me, that is a really good compromise in terms of offering that space, extra space and flexibility. Space by itself, however, is not enough. It's also about the layout. We've chosen a very simple, logical layout where there isn't any wasted space and it's all usable. So that's also important. And having the opportunity to either have a separate room which can be used not just as an extra bedroom, but as a storeroom, a study, or a dining area. It's about choice and it's about flexibility. So it's badged as 1.5 beds, but it's not necessarily could be used as that. We also talked about potentially for somebody who might be completely bedbound, being able to open up the whole space to create a kind of completely open plan environment. So this, the way that the scheme's been designed, it does allow for any of those options at relatively little cost and, equally importantly, relatively little disruption. Having been involved in a lot of remodelling projects over the years, I know all too well that you can take a footprint that looks like you could easily remodel it and then discover that there are structural walls and service routes and all sorts of things running through which make it costly and difficult. So, we have discussed in some detail all of those sorts of things and thought them through at the beginning as an inherent part of the design rather than as an afterthought. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll come back to you, Tom, because I think that's something I remember some years back that I think one of your colleagues, Kevin Williamson, who's on the call, we did some work about remodelling sheltered housing in Westminster, and some of those design features limited the amount that you could do. So, Tom, sorry, over to you.
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms of local authorities, we've had 2 schemes now that have gone through with 1 bed plus homes, so Carlton Dene and Melville Gardens. I'd say that both have been quite warmly received from planners, so no sort of big concerns, and it's very sort of clear that it is a 1 bed home, and the sort of the flexible space is purposefully made sort of too small to be classed as a bedroom, so that also avoids things like the bedroom tax. So that sort of helps to sort of smooth over those problems.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I know Sally's put the case study that the team wrote on Melville Gardens up in the chat box. Now, one of the things about these happy hours is that we often get other award-winning architects come and join us, and so this is also a bit of peer-to-peer scrutiny. So I know we got Claire and Tim who've posted some questions, and the first one from Claire is, Irene and Tom, have you managed to build a passive house scheme for older people yet? Exclamation mark. Well, no, it's a question actually. I wonder if the conflicts between small north-facing windows, sufficient daylight, or large south-facing windows versus overheating can be overcome for this sector. A really valid question. Any thoughts, either of you?
Yeah, hi Claire. Well, we haven't finished one yet. We've got one that's literally just starting on site now, which is Melville Gardens, which I can see you've done a little other comment about, which was the one for Phoenix, which isn't an extra care scheme. It's more of an independent living scheme, with also flats for some postgraduate students slotted in there too, so intergenerational. We're working with the contractor now to get that on site, due to start any day. So very happy to share more once we're kind of a bit further along, but that's the furthest, in terms of older people's housing, that's the furthest advance that we've got at the moment.
It's a good point to the windows though, I think,
yeah,
because that I think is something we worked through at length with Liz on Carlton Dene, as if it's actually acceptable to have quite small north-facing windows, and sort of how that will impact on the residents sort of living there. So it's trying to have that balance, I think, between heat performance, but also outlook, ventilation, and daylight.
Yeah, and we were lucky on, well, lucky in some ways, but Melville Gardens was east-west facing. It was 2 blocks. We didn't really have any north-south facing orientation, which gave us challenges in terms of getting as much south sun as we could, and we cranked the blocks to help with that, but we didn't have that quite so much of a direct issue on that one.
But I think this is when it comes down to getting the design right from day one. So actually, which way you're choosing to face your dwelling, you might have a north-south orientation, but you face your living spaces south, so that they can have larger windows, so that they can have more sun. So it's about getting the design right in that respect.
Right. And as I said, we have a number of peers, and Tim, who's done a lot of work on HAPPI award-winning schemes. Some lovely projects here. Great to see how many happy residents. Your airtightness targets are very ambitious. We'd be interested to know how you intend to achieve them.
Lots of quality control, I think, is usually the answer. We did do a passive house scheme, a quite pioneering one, not for older people, but a general needs flat for Origin Housing Association in London back in 2012, I think we finished it, and that was a massive learning curve. We did that on a D&B contract with Durkins, who was their first passive house. We hit the target, so it wasn't certified in the end. But so airtightness was seen as the biggest challenge pretty much on that project, and it was, what I learned from that was, it was very much down to working with the individual subcontractors who were doing, all of those critical junctions about taping things in the right way, lapping things in the right way, getting the detailing right in the first place, and working out where the airtightness layer sits, so people don't put nails through it when they're putting pictures on the wall, all of that sort of stuff, which I think we've learned a huge amount since then. But it was the day-to-day quality control on site that I think was the absolute key. And obviously, as more and more schemes are being built in this way, the knowledge is becoming much wider and better understood. So I think there's less need for that. But it also helps in terms of quality control and other things as well, other build aspects as well, because you're looking so carefully at those smaller things. You generally get better quality overall on the build, and I think there were fewer defects generally on that scheme. I don't know, Claire, if you've got other things to add there, but
yeah, no, I was just going to say about the defects, but you just covered that.
Well, look, we're coming up to close. We've got quite a few questions still to go. I know some of them are some more comments. So thanks, Alistair. Great to hear from you about your work in the Northwest, and Linda about the service charge element. Somebody else has asked here, I think a commissioner from Gloucestershire, how is design reflected in development costs? What's the impact, for example, Homes England grant levels and impact on residents in terms of rent and service charges? I don't sure whether you're the GLA or Homes England funded, Liz, or whether that's GLA. So they run a similar sort of program. So any thoughts around Homes England grant levels?
Not specifically. I mean, we did secure good level of grant. Don't think it's appropriate to talk about the detail of that, especially as I'm no longer working for Westminster, but I'm sure somebody at Westminster City Council could talk about that. But as I said before, what we did do was we actually worked, I commissioned some consultants, specialist consultants, to develop a financial model which allowed us, a bespoke financial model which allows us to feed in all of the different costs and ensure that we are going to deliver an affordable scheme, both in capital terms, but equally and equally as importantly, and sometimes forgotten, in revenue terms, because actually the capital costs will be spent in a short period of time. The revenue costs will be over 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And so actually they are at least as important as how much it costs to build.
I'm going to sort of wrap up in a minute, but there are a couple of questions I do want to ask. One is from Alison. Were there any planning problems with the sight lines to the church?
It was quite high on the planners' agenda, and so from very early on we did lots of sort of certified views and sort of almost framed the massing out, almost, you know, sort of in line with these key views. In the end, I think Historic England did have some niggles, but I think the benefits of the scheme in the end, you know, were clear that it was going to, you know, benefit that site and the surrounding area.
Well,
and we got, I mean, importantly, we got planning permission at the first go without any problems.
Great. Great. Well, I know my uncle used to be a parishioner of that church, so when I just saw it, I thought, oh, I recognise that. Isabel, do people own or rent their flats? How's the common area supported and paid for? Liz, can you just remind us on that?
Yeah, so Carlton Dene is going to be 100% social rented, and nominations agreement through the local authority, obviously, in that respect. Details still being worked on. And as I say, we obviously, as with any of these sorts of schemes, the cost of running the communal facilities falls back on the residents, essentially, unless either the council is prepared to subsidise it or you can generate additional income. So part of the thinking for the cafe and other facilities is not just about the community element, although that is the key driver, is also about the practical cost to try and offset some of that and ensure that the residents, that the whole thing is affordable. And as I've just said, in order to check that, we commissioned a bespoke financial model to enable us to run and rerun all of the costs through to make sure that it's coming out at something that residents will be able to afford, because there is absolutely no point in building something that no one can afford to live in.
Absolutely, especially in this current cost of living crisis.
Yeah.
Look, can I thank you all for your wonderful presentations? Can I just ask each of you if there's a final word you want to say before I bring this to a close? David, do you want to kick off?
Well, congratulations to the designers of the scheme. I think it's going to be a really nice element of the South Kilburn regeneration. It's what it missed. It didn't have up until now, something that's going to have a kind of, you know, a focal point, and that cafe will really do it.
Team Levitt Bernstein from both the London and Manchester offices or studios.
Well, I think it's a big thank you to all our clients who support us in, you know, the design that we're bringing together, that, you know, forward-looking, and I think we're achieving some great things. And I think one of the things that really, you know, the Preston scheme, which has been finished, some of the comments, it always comes back to the residents and how much they enjoy living there. You know, the fact that they say it's like being on holiday every day. And they're not just, they really mean it. And the fact that they can welcome their friends and family in, I think that's the biggest. That's the biggest achievement that we can get from all of it.
Yes,
Yeah,
I'll add to that if anybody would like to have a look around, we are offering to take some tours, but also you can just pop in. The bistro is open to the public. I think it's closed on a Monday and Tuesday, but the rest of the week, but at lunchtime, you can just drop in and have a look at that area of the building and enjoy some of their food, which is excellent.
No, they certainly looked appealing in the images that you showed there, Gillian. Liz, any other final comments or?
No, else? I think a lot of, I absolutely support what Irene said, and at the end of the day, and sorry, don't get upset anyone. For me, it's not about certification, it's not about awards, it's about whether people enjoy living there and benefit from it, and that for me is absolutely, you know, the top and bottom of the whole thing.
Well, look, on behalf of the Housing LIN, can I thank each of you for a fantastic presentation. I know we've overrun by about 5 minutes, but I hope you don't mind. I think the quality of what you've all shared, the lessons learned, the sort of going into some of the technical detail, looking at the operational, and importantly, I think, as we finished on, really understanding the impact of the changing quality of life it will offer residents of Westminster, and that South Kilburn regeneration is really important. If you found this of interest, and this is your first time to the HAPPI Hour sessions that the Housing LIN operates, we've got another one next week, and please do join us, where we'll be putting the spotlight on the Newcastle University Hospital Trust development, creating more than a real estate, looking at the connections of housing and health as part of the new campus that they're building for ageing and vitality. We'll be looking at that with the real estate development partners and the university next Tuesday. Please do join us for that. But on behalf of the Housing LIN team, thank you, Sally, for coordinating so expertly behind the scenes, and thank you to all of you for presenting so beautifully. I wish you a good evening, and Irene, I hope your throat gets better soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeremy.
Bye.
Bye.
All right,
Bye-bye.
bye.